Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I told you yesterday, I suffered some data loss. We had a little blip in the internet here, and I've lost some stuff. So I'm going to have to rewrite some stuff for this unit. And instead of doing that this morning, I think I'm just going to give you a couple of little sort of mini lectures that will help get you started on the poetry unit. So first off, everybody has different feelings about poetry, and as I may have told you, I love poetry so much that it's hard for me to be objective enough to teach it. So this is always a challenge for me, and in a way I'm glad we waited until the end of the term to start this unit. But whenever I encounter a poem that I don't understand, there's a couple of things I do. But first off, let me talk to you about what a poem is in the 21st century and how it's different from a play or a short story and how we approach it. The big difference is we don't really any longer know what a poem looks like. You can take a play and look at it without even reading it, and you can say, okay, that's probably a play because it looks like a play. Or you can take a short story and you can look at that and you can say, well, it's probably a short story because it looks like a short story. So before you ever read a word with a short story or a play, you kind of know what you're looking at. And if you know what you're looking at, you know what you're looking for, and especially in an academic class. If you know what you're looking for, it's easier to find it, obviously. Poetry, not so much. In the 20th century, the definition of what is a poem simply exploded. There are things that don't even have words to them that people call poetry, and other strange sort of things, sort of found poetry and things like that. So you're not going to know. You pick up a piece of writing and you look at it, and you're not going to know that it's a poem off the bat until you dig into it a little bit. So that's a problem because there are so many different kinds of poems, and there's so many different interpretations and so many answers that could be right as there are readers of poetry. So it's difficult to talk in a unified manner about a poem, but there are a couple of things that help for an academic class like this. And I want to talk to you about a few of those this morning. Obviously, I'm not a big fan, well, you wouldn't know that I'm not, but I'm not a big fan of categorizing poetry. I think that detracts from the value of it overall. However, when I look at something that looks like a poem and I want to try to understand it and look at how it works and penetrate into the depths of its meaning, I often, if I'm confused, I almost always start by attempting to categorize it, to say it's this kind of a poem, because then that helps me know what to look for, and I am also more immediately aware of when I haven't found what I'm looking for, I need to go back and look at my definition and the category that I've placed it into. Again, this is a preliminary start to understanding a poem. If I just sit and categorize poems all day long, I haven't done anything of any value, and in fact, I've probably violated the spirit of poetry. However, to start to categorize a poem helps me understand it, just like you know you're looking at a short story, so you know what to look for. You know you're looking at a play, you know what to look for. So there are three overall large categories that still survive more or less intact into the 21st century. And I want to talk to you a bit about each of those. And I've given you 3 examples. I just emailed you 2 examples. And there are a couple in your book that I'm also going to point to. So one of the ways to start out looking at a poem is to try to categorize it. The first category, and there really only are 3 major ones. The first category is called narrative poetry. Okay? And just like anything else, a narrative poem tells a story. So it'll have a narrator or a narrative voice. It'll have some kind of dramatic structure to it, like the Freytag's Pyramid most of the time. and it'll tell some kind of a story that you could write down. You could take a pen and a piece of paper and write down the story in a few lines. A very good example of a narrative poem is Ulysses by Tennyson, which isn't in your textbook, but I gave you a link to it. It's one of my 2 or 3 most favorite poems, and in fact it moves me so deeply that I can't get through it without weeping. I've never been able to read it publicly without breaking down. If you're a fan of the TV show Frasier, you will notice that in the very last episode of the show, where Frasier is leaving his job, there are quotes from this poem by Tennyson that are interspersed in the dialogue for that show. We might look at that a little bit later on. But anyway, a narrative poem tells a story. It has a narrator who may or may not be identified, and it may or may not be first person or third person. In other words, some of the stuff that you can use to analyze a short story or even a play, you can also bring to identifying and penetrating to the meaning of a narrative poem, but you have to recognize that it's a narrative poem first. So if it tells a story, it's got a narrator, and it relates a sequence of events, it's a narrative poem, and so categorizing it helps me know what to look for. The second category is what is called lyric poetry. I'm going to grab my little visual aid here. Lyric poetry. Okay? Lyric poetry is beautiful, lyrical, like the lyrics of a song. That's why they're called lyrics, because they're usually lyrical poetry. The word lyric has to do with comes from the Greek word lyre, L-Y-R-E, the stringed instrument that they played on. It also means beautiful or sounds pretty. Okay, an example is the Shakespeare sonnet, which I've mentioned here, sonnet number 73, which I've mentioned here, which is in your textbook. You'll notice the beautiful imagery of the trees. The bare trees with birds sitting in them are like the choir area of a church with the choir singing. There's beautiful and lovely imagery in that poem. It's on page, what did I say? I can't see it. Page 583 in McMahon. Okay, lyric poetry is often short, and a classic example of lyric poetry is what is called a sonnet, which comes from the Italian word to sound, so it sounds lovely. A lyric poem may tell a story, it may not. It may just be a little screenshot of a sensory image or something that moved the poet deeply, and the poet tried to transfer the experience into words. Another great example of a sonnet in Shakespeare is the speech that I've sent you this morning from the first act of Romeo and Juliet. If I profane with my unworthiest hands, that's a sonnet. It's split between 2 characters, and it's in a play, but it's a sonnet form. So if you read through that, you'll see what a sonnet looks like. But sonnets are an example of lyric poetry. Lyric poetry, beautiful imagery. If you read it aloud, it sounds lovely, and they're usually pretty short. There are various kinds of sonnets, but we won't get into worrying about categorizing those. Okay, so if you're looking at a poem, it's short, it has beautiful imagery, and it sounds lovely. You can categorize it as lyric poetry, and then when you come to evaluate it and understand it, you can evaluate it as a lyric poem. And again, not to beat you over the head with it, but categorizing the poem helps me understand it. Categorizing in and of itself is of no value. Categorizing as a means to understanding is a valuable place to start. And finally, the third kind of poetry is called dramatic poetry. Here's my little thing. Okay. And dramatic poetry uses special effects. Quite often the dramatic poem is like it sounds, it's dramatic. And it'll have thunder and lightning, or deliberately offensive imagery, or deliberately outlandish imagery, or things that have a certain amount of shock value. So the My Last Duchess poem by Browning, which is on page 667 in your textbook, is the classic example of dramatic poetry. So the first thing to do in trying to understand a poem, if you really wish to understand it, the place that I start is not to deny my immediate emotional response. And I have immediate emotional responses to almost every poem I read, which I can't always explain. But if I need to understand my feelings, then I go to my academic training and I say, well, that's lyric, that's narrative, that's dramatic. And I put it into that slot just by way of being able to examine it from that perspective. And if that perspective doesn't work, then I try another one. But again, and I'm only going to say it one more time, to categorize a poem is just a way to start understanding it. It's a way of getting outside of, well, I don't know what the heck it means. Well, that doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't get the conversation anywhere. It doesn't enlighten understanding. Nothing happens when you say, I don't understand. You say, I don't understand, so I'm going to try to categorize it. I'm going to try to see what kind of a poem it is, providing that's where you start, but you move on beyond that. You say, I'm going to try to figure out what kind of a poem this is. Then that's a beginning to help understanding, as opposed to just being satisfied with I don't understand, which is a useless and infantile statement. To try to understand begins, for me at least, in poetry by trying to look at it from one of those three perspectives. And almost every poem can be put in one of those three places, and then you can look at it standing in that place. You can look at it and see if that helps you penetrate to the underlying meaning. And quite often it does. Okay, I'm going to stop and get this one up on YouTube, and then I have one other little thing for you this morning. Probably this week, most of the stuff I'm going to give you is going to be videos like this, because I'm going to be busy retyping some of the stuff that I lost over the weekend. Okay, so look for some more stuff shortly, and I will see you in a bit. Bye.